speaking of which, atau juga pakai by the way, by the way, by the way, by the way. Speaking of which, by the way, ngomong-ngomong.
Speaking of which, where is it?
Speaking of which, that reporter, Casey Carnes.
Speaking of which, I thought she was coming tonight.
Speaking of which, there's another person you need to make reparations to.
Speaking of which, those coyotes.
Speaking of which, there's actually a contest in Pinewood Valley this Friday.
Speaking of which, that was a fair few outlaws you rounded up last night.
Speaking of which, that thing pecking at your leg, it's just a little cleaner fish.
Okay, speaking of which, Mrs. Lydia has a man friend.
Speaking of which, it would be great if the two of you could help me track down my reindeer.
And speaking of which, I have more of that airplane guff to attend to.
Speaking of which, I have 15 essays to get through tonight.
Speaking of which, I have a wonderful dinner planned for this evening.
Speaking of which, I have a beautiful star for your tree.
And speaking of which, explains the details of the buyout.
Oh, and by the way, the suit, it wasn't cheap.
I'm fine, by the way.
It would also, by the way, be the courteous thing.
I'm Ray, by the way.
Oh, by the way, this is a friend of mine, Tree.
By the way, I would never take advantage of anyone.
Oh, by the way, I got a note this morning.
A little too plunging, by the way, I think, yes.
Yeah, Sarah, by the way, I think you look fantastic.
Oh, by the way, I hope your son is feeling better.
Oh, and by the way, I don't appreciate anyone going in my locker.
By the way, I'm goofy. Send more money.
And by the way, I'm not leaving.
By the way, I'm not actually running a fish and chip shop.
Oh, by the way, I found this in your grass.
Hey, by the way, if you could give me 5 or 6 hours, I sure would appreciate it.
Oh, hey, by the way, guys, where's my bro Brennan?
Hey, by the way, what do you want for your birthday?
Oh, by the way, no separate deals.
Okay. By the way, the office wanted me to bring you these phone messages.
By the way, where's the library?